It's spooky season, and I'm glad you could make it. Grab a chair, some Pepsi, and a slice, because tonight, we have business. We are going to stay up all night and beat Castlevania. All of them. Well, at least the NES trilogy. Welcome to a special 3-part series where we will venture deep into the forgotten crypts of Castle Dracula and see how well this classic trilogy holds up. Today, we begin with Castlevania, and why it's a masterpiece. Released for the Famicom Disk System in 1986 as Devil's Castle Dracula, and for the NES the following year, Castlevania has one of the great gaming legacies, spawning a massive series of action platformers and tie-in media. The original game is often remembered for its brooding atmosphere, relentless music, and grueling difficulty that will grind all but the most hardcore to piles of sweat and gamer gunk. Castlevania is a game that remains, in my humble approximation, underappreciated. That's a crazy claim given the popularity of Castlevania and its infinite sequels, but despite its reputation as a tightly wound action platformer and as a staple in the camp horror and retro gaming diets, the popular and critical consensus of the game misses one indispensable detail. But before that, we must set the stage and know its players. I will always have a deeply unsophisticated adoration for Castlevania, because it was my introduction to retro games and also works as a microcosm of my growth as a person and amateur critic. Like many people in the 25 to 30 range, my introduction to video game critique, internet culture, and retro gaming at large was the angry video game nerd. I don't remember exactly when I first heard the name Castlevania, but some of the first AVGN episodes I watched when they were new was his 4-part series on Castlevania. And there was, of course, the original episode of AVGN that immortalized Castlevania II: Simon's Quest.
This game sucks. Castlevania 1 and 3 are great classic Nintendo games, but for Castlevania 2: Simon's Quest, the game designers obviously were not thinking straight.
Inspired by the love and mystique he created around the series, I bought Castlevania on GBA, the classic NES series. It's one of the earliest games I remember buying with my allowance money. That by itself would make this game personally unforgettable, but it was an experience far beyond finance. When I booted up Castlevania on my flickering SP, it was a familiar world, but older and arcane. Because of my parents holding on to their old SNES, my earliest game experiences were Super Mario World and Super Baseball Simulator 1000. My experience with older cartridge-based games was real, but limited. So starting Castlevania and seeing and hearing 8-bit graphics and sound for the first time and moving the slow, clunky hero across the first hallway was like being sucked backwards in time. I'd vicariously experienced these sights and sounds on AVGN, but to experience it myself, in my own hands, with my own ears, was transcendent. That sounds like hyperbole because Castlevania is regarded as a simple camp action platformer from the 1980s, but it was the first time I consciously sought out and experienced something outside of my inherited space and time. It's the earliest moment in my life I can think of where I was aware of how little my life and the experiences therein represented in the grand scope of history and art. It was beautiful. But then Castlevania tells you what it's about. It quickly asserts dominance, and the feeling of awe was torn away to give me the most intense gaming experience of my life up to that point. From those early deaths, Many of the technical limitations of early gaming came into sight for the first time. After getting clobbered and creamed in the second level for a good hour, my wonderment was gone, replaced by a declaration that this game is fucking bullshit. This was, no doubt, inspired by the filthy mouth of AVGN and its creator James Rolfe. But beyond the potty mouth, what amazes me is that to this day, 11 years after his Castlevania video released, his structure permeates my mind, with this review mimicking James's experience of wonder before being slapped by Castlevania's mechanical truth.
Well, I never said it would be easy.
Playing on a tiny Game Boy screen was simply too much. It didn't deter me from trying out the rest of the series, but I stayed away from the classic Castlevania games for a long time as I jumped ship to Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow on the DS. Eventually, I would work myself back to Castlevania with the original NES version. It's a common game, but one of my prized video game possessions. The feel and age of the cartridge, coupled with the gothic cover art, made this game an irresistible draw. Because you can't save your game on the NES version, I never beat this game on this cartridge, but I would conquer the terrors of Castlevania on the Anniversary Collection, where saving is mercifully allowed through a save state system. Even ignoring the inability to save in the NES version, Castlevania is a ridiculous game, one of the hardest good games on the NES, for two notorious complementary reasons. Getting hit knocks the player character Simon Belmont backwards, and the game is filled with instant death pits. A major source of frustration for many players is that despite Simon having a health bar that allows him to survive about 4 hits, it's often the case, especially in later levels, that a single hit kills Simon because he will go careening off the nearest ledge. For many players, this will overwhelm the entire experience in practice and in memory, and that's unfortunate, because Castlevania is an almost flawless game, mechanically and narratively. On a mechanical level, Castlevania is a rock-solid action platformer, but it may initially feel like a clunky mess. Anyone used to Super Mario Bros. Or Contra will be taken aback by the slow controls. Simon is slow. His jump can't be controlled in midair, and his whip attacks have a delay. Moving from a standard action game or platformer of the era to Castlevania is not unlike going from Devil May Cry to Dark Souls today. There is a learning curve for playing a different style action game that some players will instinctively bounce off of, but Castlevania fully understands itself and successfully builds around its seemingly sluggish controls. Despite the whip having a delay, it creates an active hitbox that holds and moves with Simon if you whip in midair. While jumping is taxing in both precision and punishment, the whip itself is forgiving. The game is mostly predictive combat, where you have to identify when and where the monster will be and get your whip or sub-weapon there before the monster does. So, while an enemy like the Hunchbacks in level 3 are erratic, their jumps have predictable arcs that Simon can move and attack around. Even so, the whip feels restrictive, because it can only be cracked left or right. That leaves a majority of the area around Simon vulnerable, and it is here that sub-weapons come in, and it is these sub-weapons that are the mechanical genius of Castlevania. To take care of Simon's blind spots, there's the axe that arcs out and in front of Simon, the boomerang that flies forward and comes back across the screen, the firebomb that arcs below and leaves a flame where it lands, the watch that freezes all enemies, and the dagger, which sucks. Those names, by the way, come straight from the English manual of the game. The series will later expand on the sub-weapons, adding more and giving the ability to modify them, but in Castlevania, it's a simple roster of items that all have strengths and weaknesses. Unless it's the dagger. Then it's just weaknesses. One of the most exciting parts of Castlevania is that I almost always like the sub-weapon I have, but also simultaneously wish I had a completely different one. There is a lot of thinking that goes on to, do you change your sub-weapon out if you get the opportunity to, or do you keep the one that you currently have? And despite its intense difficulty, Castlevania does a great job introducing the player to new challenges. The first level features very simple enemies and only a small handful of death pits. Most enemies throughout the game are introduced in fairly safe environments, either locked away like this Black Knight in level 2, or on simple terrain like the first Hunchback in level 3. Mechanically, this game is great, and almost self-evidently so, but to my surprise, it was playing Castlevania on easy mode that revealed it as an NES masterpiece. Castlevania is great, but not as great as the names you see on screen. These are this channel's supporters over on patreon.com and here on YouTube as YouTube members. Thanks to their generous support, keeping this channel active is viable for me. If you would like to support, follow the links in the description below. Beyond getting your names in the credits, you will also receive other benefits like early scripted video access, exclusive polls, merch, and Discord benefits. Once again, thank you so much to everyone who supports and makes this channel possible. After Castlevania established itself as a hit franchise, the Japanese version, Devil's Castle Dracula, was re-released for the Famicom in 1993. On a technical level, this was a downgrade. The Famicom Disk System was an add-on to the Famicom that utilized floppy disks instead of cartridges. One of the major benefits that was lost in this downgrade was saving. So while the 93 Famicom version seems like a straight downgrade, there was a major change that makes it noteworthy: the inclusion of an easy mode. Easy mode gives the player 9 lives instead of 3, starts the player off with 30 hearts instead of 0, increases Simon's defense, lowers boss HP, retains sub-weapons after death, and removes the knockback from getting hit. Easy mode makes the game almost comically easy, but it's awesome. By being so relaxed, easy mode serves as a tour of the game. It allows players to steamroll and make mistakes, and it was while chilling out with easy mode that I noticed Castlevania's structural brilliance. This is the indispensable detail I referenced earlier that many critiques miss. Because Castlevania has no cutscenes, it's easy to ignore its narrative strengths. Like most games of the era, the plot itself is very simple. Dracula is resurrected and must be destroyed by Simon Belmont, the descendant of legendary vampire hunter Christopher Belmont. As the NES manual puts it, you've arrived at Castlevania, and you're here on business. Unfortunately, everybody's home this evening. Bats, ghosts, every kind of creature you can imagine. You'll find them all over the place, if they don't find you first. Once you make it to the tower, you can count on a duel to the death. The Count has waited 100 years for a rematch. He's ready. Are you? Castlevania's manual is awesome, and that is the entire extent of the plot. With a bent towards the cinematic, Castlevania is not merely content with a progression of levels that get mechanically more difficult like Super Mario Bros. It wants the player to emotionally feel Simon's journey. Simon stares down the silhouetted castle at the rusted gates. The foreboding intro track, Front Gates, prepares us for a night of terrors. But then we get the harmless entryway that gives Simon a pool of hearts, the dagger, and a fully upgraded whip. Vampire Killer is a badass and famous track that fills the player with confidence as the mindless zombies fold beneath the power of Simon's whip. In level 2, the challenges mount as zombies are replaced by knights and the bats replaced with Medusa heads. Level 3 tightens the screws with erratic white skeletons and hunchbacks. Instant death pits become common, and the bosses are getting tougher. Level 2, and especially Level 3, will take a new player longer than the first, but they're triumphant. Despite the increased difficulty, Simon is always moving up towards Dracula's tower. The challenges are greater because Simon and the player are on the attack and tearing through Dracula's minions. But after defeating the mummy men, the floor gives out and Simon goes tumbling down into the catacombs of the tower. While the score up to this point has been filled with dark and edgy action tracks that make the player feel cool, the Catacombs theme, Walking Edge, is a heavier and scarier song whose opening sections show that we are now in the belly of the beast. It doesn't help that the first sight we see is a skeleton, perhaps that of another vampire hunter. We are further down than we have ever been. But it also means that the rise is more aggressive and faster. When Out of Time is cooking on the soundtrack in the final stage, we know we're at the end of a ferocious night. and this is it. Now or never. This is a simple construction, and if we're talking about a modern action-adventure game, or a novel, or a film, it's hardly interesting. What makes Castlevania worth understanding narratively is that it comes from a period where few video games outside of RPGs were interested in telling stories. Super Mario Bros. And Contra are mechanical masterpieces, but their levels didn't have the emotional highs and lows of Castlevania. Castlevania, while perhaps not as mechanically refined in how it paces and tutorializes its gameplay as those other two games, is an early sign of the promise of video games. This medium, still in its relative infancy in 1986, isn't just about complicated electronic crossword puzzles where correctly timed inputs are the beginning and end of the experience. Castlevania shows that not only can a story be conveyed through video games, but so can tone and atmosphere. The more traditional art forms that make up video games, such as music and box art, have been strong since the beginning of the medium. Look at the awesome cover art of Missile Command on the Atari 2600. Castlevania has similarly great box art, comparable to the exciting fantasy and sci-fi box art of many Atari 2600 games. But Castlevania delivers the tone of its box art, of horrible monsters, and a nightmare journey through a castle of pure evil. Castlevania is certainly not the first game to show off the power of video games as a narrative medium, but it's one of the absolute best from its era, and that, I think, should be its dominant reputation rather than death pits and punishing difficulty. It took me many years to fully understand Castlevania as more than the curious beginning to a series that would deliver the more complicated adventures that define the series run in the 2000s. This progression from uncomplicated love of aesthetic to critical reverence perfectly mirrors James's Castlevania experience in his video from all those years ago. But when we're talking about a game whose reputation has been most set by AVGN, then we're talking about the moribund sequel, Castlevania II: Simon's Quest. Join me in part 2, where we'll play Simon's Quest, a game that I think, unironically, is a deeply underrated game that absolutely deserves our nerdy admiration. Stay safe out there, because we got 2 more games, 2 more nightmares to survive, and I'll be there with you. Stay tuned.